Welcome to Remote Access. We will begin in just a moment. Welcome to AJC Remote Access. We will begin in just a moment. Welcome to AJC Remote Access. We will begin in just one moment. Welcome to AJC Remote Access. We'll begin in just a moment. Welcome to AJC Remote Access. I would like to turn it over to Susanna Ivanier for opening remarks. Susanna, you have the floor.
Good afternoon and welcome to Remote Access, the future of U.S. foreign policy and national security, a conversation taking place on the sidelines of the Republican National Convention. I am Susanna Ivanier, co-chair of Access Los Angeles. For those of you who are joining for the first time, Access is the young professional division of AJC Global, whose mission is to combat anti-Semitism, promote Israel's place in the world, and to promote democratic values. I'm delighted to introduce to you our experts for this session. First, we have Jennifer Cafarella. Jennifer Cafarella is the inaugural National Security Fellow at the Institute of Study of War, a position created to sponsor rising national security leaders. Ms. Cafarella's work focuses on U.S. defense strategy, including how the U.S. must adapt to current and future threats. She is an established expert on Syria, the Middle East, and jihadism. Ms. Cafarella regularly briefs senior policy and decision makers, as well as U.S. and allied military units. Her written work has been featured across major media outlets, including Foreign Affairs magazine and Washington Post, the New York Times, and others. We have Danielle Pletka, a senior fellow in Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on U.S. foreign policy, generally, and Middle East specifically. Until January 2020, Ms. Pletka was the Senior Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies of AEI. Concurrently, she also teaches U.S. Middle East policy at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Algene Sajery is the founder and CEO of Catalyst Global Strategies, LLC. Ms. Sajery is a seasoned foreign policy and national security expert with over 20 years of legislative and political affairs experience in the U.S. Congress, as well as the corporate and nonprofit sectors. At Catalyst, Ms. Sajery forges strategic partnerships between non-governmental organizations, businesses, governments, and private donors in the U.S. and the developing world. Together, she and her clients are catalysts for good, who develop and execute government relations and public affairs strategies to improve global health, foster economic development, promote human and civil rights, and solve complex global security challenges. Ms. Sajery also helps organizations and businesses thrive by showing them how to effectively navigate government from Washington to Geneva to Accra. Welcome to these esteemed panelists. Without further ado, I'll now hand it over to Dana Steiner, Director of Access Global, to moderate our conversation. Dana, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and thank you to this incredible group who are joining us today for this very important discussion. We're so happy to have you. Two brief reminders before we begin our discussion. First, you can submit questions for our panelists by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Second, and perhaps most significantly for today and last week's conversation, AJC is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization that does not endorse or support candidates or political parties. With that being said, let's begin. At AJC, we care about policies and nuance and don't believe that any part of an administration is either perfect or an overall failure. In that arena, as we continue to navigate these unprecedented times on a global scale, how has the foreign policy and national security landscape adapted? Can you point to concrete successes as well as failures that the next administration can build on? Let's start with Danielle.
Gee, thanks for throwing me under that bus, Dana. Look, honestly, it's a softball. There are lots and lots of successes that the Trump administration can point to. I think for many of us, it's important to separate the Trump rhetoric from his administration's foreign policy. And we could argue for way longer than we have on this conversation about whether that represents what the president thinks or not, but that's not really relevant. So, let's start with Iran policy. For a lot of us who thought that the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal was a bad deal in the Obama administration, many of us also thought that the Trump administration made a mistake in walking away from it, that they wouldn't be able to reimpose the kind of crippling sanctions, the rhetoric that Hillary Clinton used on Iran, and they really have. They've done that. Iranian currency has collapsed. Iranian exports have collapsed. And I suspect that if Donald Trump is reelected, the Iranians will come to the table. That's an accomplishment. On Russia, I think we've seen the most stringent sanctions that have been imposed on collaborators with the Putin regime, collaborators with those who have oppressed Ukrainians, those who are, acting in malign ways throughout what Russia likes to call its near abroad. And, we can say the same thing about China. Even the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, a lot of Democrats were very critical. They thought that if I can use an expression that probably all of you who are younger than me don't remember, they thought the Arab street would explode. And you know what? It didn't happen. In fact, we just saw an Arab Gulf country, the United Arab Emirates, make peace with Israel. How awesome is that? So those are things that I think the administration, a new Biden administration could build on, but there are also things that a Trump administration could build on as well.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Jenny, I'll turn it to you.
Sure. What I would agree with everything that Danielle just outlined. What I would add is just a couple specifics on the situation in the Middle East. The Trump administration does claim credit, I think rightly, for completing the defeat of the territorial caliphate. Now, of course, the administration inherited the counter-ISIS campaign from the previous administration, but there is no certain outcomes with an enemy as vicious and committed as the Islamic State. And I do think it's a significant accomplishment that the US was able both to dismantle the physical caliphate and then to maintain counterterrorism pressure on ISIS as it has attempted to reconstitute. That said, the challenge that I see that this administration in a second term or a new administration will face is that the reluctance of President Trump to stay involved militarily and in other ways in the Middle East, the reluctance to commit financial resources, for example, where they are needed, creates a vacuum. That vacuum is compounded by the sanctions regime on Iran, which is forcing, in a positive sense, a contraction of the scope and scale of the military operations that the Iranians can conduct across the region. That's a good thing, but it creates an opening. And this administration has not yet been able to put forward a policy that actually plugs those gaps or creates momentum toward some form of stability. What we've actually seen is further instability. There are a few counter examples, and I would point to the opportunity that we have in Iraq right now with the new Iraqi prime minister. But on the whole, I think there are some pretty big vacuums that are going to continue to challenge the United States in this region moving forward.
Great, thank you so much for that analysis. Algene.
Thank you for having me on this panel today. It's a pleasure to be here with these esteemed experts as well. I'm going to say that I do believe that the UAE Israel deal is one thing that the administration, the Trump administration, can point to as a success. I think there are many reasons why the UAE entered that deal, and it's not all the Trump administration's doing. However, I do think that is one thing that they have done correctly, and it's a positive step that any administration can build on in the future. I do think, though, that any future administration, whether it's Biden or Trump, needs to work to reestablish our alliances, needs to work to support the international world order. It needs to support U.S. leadership in multilateral fora, needs to go ahead and reassure our historical allies that we are going to be there, you know, for the long run, and that we're going to assume a leadership role. And that's respect to the Middle East, and it's also with respect to Asia and the rest of the world. I think that the administration, the current administration, has had some major foreign policy gaffes, and that the peace deal, for example, in the Middle East that Jared Kushner was leading, hasn't really produced the results in the economic stability or the programming to allow for economic stability on the Palestinian side. We want to see, I think, a two-state solution, one that recognizes that, you know, there should be a peaceful and secure two states side by side. We haven't seen the real political backing on either end, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But that is something that I think the next administration is going to have to tackle with real earnest and vigor. And it's, of course, a very tough issue to tackle. I do give them credit for trying and making an attempt, but I believe that there's more that can be done to stir up the Egyptians, to ensure that there is more of a focus on the economic prosperity and the security in the region for all people in the region.
Thank you so much, Algene, for that analysis. I realize that since we've pivoted a little bit to speaking about the Middle East, I think we'll just stay there for a couple of minutes and then we'll travel the globe. But in the meantime, as we already discussed, there was a historic watershed deal that took place between Israel and the UAE about 2 weeks ago. And while AJC has long been at the forefront of engaging the Middle East and the Arab world, we definitely are excited by the prospect after 30 years of engaging with the region. It was quite exciting to see the normalization between these two countries. With that being said, there has been some speculation that other nations like Bahrain and Oman may be next in terms of normalizing relations. We did see coming out of Bahrain this morning, I believe, that there were questions about whether this kind of relationship would move forward unless there was some sort of concrete plan for a two-state solution. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on which nations may be next? Is it Bahrain? Is it Oman? Are there other nations in the region that we can expect which may normalize relations? I'm happy to turn it over to Jennifer to start us off.
Sure. Well, I would add to what Danielle has already said. I think this is an historic achievement. I think it's a positive sign. I definitely understand the concerns from many sides regarding the viability of a two-state solution and the risk that the Palestinian issue gets left behind as regional trends turn in different directions. What I'll offer is that there are very, very, very limited examples in the Middle East where one can achieve a clean win. The complex geopolitics of this region mean that many, many, many separate issues are interrelated. And I don't, in this case, think that it is actually a zero-sum scenario. In terms of where the momentum is headed overall, I do think we have to watch and see. You know, it's difficult. We shouldn't speculate. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is, of course, making a concerted effort to make sure that there is momentum behind this and it's not just a one-off deal between Israel and the UAE. And I expect that that's going to be successful. In terms of who's going to bite first, I think that depends in part on how these trends do play out in the coming days and weeks. We have seen Sudan listed. They're, of course, beginning to allow flights to and from Israel, which is a major step forward. And I do think indicative that there's a new opportunity here to chart some peace across the region and to hopefully build on that towards other issues that, of course, we cannot leave behind, including the Palestinian one.
Thank you so much. Danielle.
So, I mean, I think, you know, I think it's a game of darts to figure out who's going to be next. For a lot of countries in the region, they're watching the election. And that's why we're here today, right? So, you know, I think there's no doubt that if our friends in the region could vote, the Israelis would vote for Donald Trump. The Iranians would vote for Joe Biden. The Saudis would vote for for Donald Trump. How the rest, I think, feel is very, you know, is very dependent on who gets elected, and that's a bad thing. So, you know, we can laugh about this, but, and believe me, I do, but at the end of the day, what you don't want is the politicization of regional issues. It really is a bad thing that Israel has become the party of, you know, the Republican Party country, and Iran has become the Democratic Party country. It's not the way you want things to be, because first of all, I think there are plenty of Democrats who do not wish to see the Islamic Republic prosper, and I know that there are plenty of Democrats in addition who are very pro-Israel. So, you know, you don't like to see this split, but there's no doubt that in the region that is the split that is perceived. Okay? And that is going to be the challenge going forward. Is what I think countries are waiting for is, you know, they're going to bide their time. Gee, you know, should I do what Mike Pompeo asks? Should I listen and follow the you know, the path of the United Arab Emirates? Or should I wait and see who wins the election? Because if Biden wins the election, the Iranians are going to feel empowered, and they're going to make the Bahrainis and the Sudanese and the Omanis very, very sorry if they open up relations with Israel. And we should have no doubt about that. So that's part of sort of our scenario imprinted on the region. I think Algene also said something really interesting, and it's something very worth returning to. You know, during the Trump administration, we've heard a real, and for me, a very heartening return by the Democratic Party to supporting principles of democracy abroad. During the Obama administration, democracy funding was decimated. The administration really put no resources behind the questions of, you know, democratic governance for the people of Syria, let alone for the people of Ukraine or the people of Libya or anywhere else. And Egypt is a perfect example of that, where you saw an administration previously that was equally comfortable with Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood leader, and with the man who is now the leader of Egypt, General Sisi, who is basically a dictator. I would love to see the Democrats put their money where their mouths are, and in a Biden administration actually return to prioritizing those issues in the Middle East. I'd love to see someone smack General Sisi, not of course physically, unless absolutely necessary, but and all of the other leaders in the region who have forgotten that the United States cares a lot about democracy.
Thank you, Danielle. Algene, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure, there's a lot there to unpack. I want to start by saying I do agree that we shouldn't, and it shouldn't be a political issue, right? What's going on in the Middle East, it shouldn't be political. It shouldn't be that it's seen that the Democratic Party is a party of Iran and the Republican Party is a party of Israel, and I don't think that's fair. I personally worked quite a lot on pro-Israel issues when I worked for Senator Ben Cardin, and he is a strong supporter of Israel, and there are many like him in the Senate, in the House, that are Democrats that are strong supporters of Israel, and, you know, supporters of many of the issues on AJC's platform, anti-BDS, all of those things. So it's really not, I think, fair to characterize it as this political split, because I don't think that, you know, the Democratic Party supports Iran's terrorist activities in the region, Iran's nuclear program, et cetera. What the Democratic Party, I believe, supports is an engagement strategy that gets us away from Iran going forward with their nuclear program, an engagement strategy that addresses in a multilateral way the challenges of Iran. I think that nobody believes that, and Danielle said it, that, you know, even if you agree or disagree with the JCPOA, most people don't believe that the Trump administration should have pulled out of the JCPOA in the way it did, right, without full ally support. And so I think we need to think through not just Democrats versus Republican and through the election, but really what works, right? And I think I really would love to look at the budgets from the Obama administration, how they supposedly decimated D&G and human rights budgets and appropriations, because I worked on human rights budgets and appropriations extensively when I was in the Senate, and it was a robust budget. Yet every single year since the Trump administration has been in power, they have presented a budget that completely slashed D&G programming. Luckily, the House and the Senate robustly in a bipartisan manner, did not adhere to those budget requests and pass appropriations that did support D&G funding. And so, you know, I think we should get past the political Democrats versus Republicans and really think about what works. And I agree, D&G funding works, D&G programs work, programs that support livelihoods work, foreign assistance does work when done right. And with appropriate oversight and with appropriate programs that are implemented with people who respect the American people and the America's leadership in the global sphere. And so I really want to get past the politics and get to the point of what works. What policies work, what funding, what programs work. And I think that's really, really important.
Thank you, Algene. And we love the discourse. I think it's so helpful to be able to navigate all the different perspectives, especially among such experts and esteemed colleagues. I'd like to take a little journey over to China as we are moving across the globe a little bit here. So I want to ask a question here. Is China a rival of the United States? Is it a partner? Is it both, or is it something else altogether? How would you say that the Trump administration or a Biden administration would approach this hugely consequential relationship? Anyone can start. You know what? I'll be the teacher today, and I'll call on someone. Algene, I know you went last time, so you'll go first this time.
Okay. I think that, you know, is China a rival, a partner? We certainly can't say it's a partner. And I do think that China believes that the United States is a rival. I think there's a possible opportunities that we need to address with China, that we need to have dialogue with China on certain things. I do think that this administration and any future Democratic administration is going to approach China in the same way, because China has ignored international norms, has ignored the human rights of its people, has ignored, you know, certain trade issues, and at the WTO. I think that the United States, the Trump administration could have gone about its China policy in a way, again, with our allies, bringing them to the table to address China in a way that was within the international fora at the WTO and et cetera. I do think that we may see more of the same with China, because right now, especially with what's going on in China and its treatment of its people, there definitely is a need to address the challenge of China. I think that's something that is very bipartisan. And I think that people recognize that. It just will vary on the tactics, right? I think that everybody agrees that it's a big challenge that we cannot ignore. And we have to restore US leadership in the global campaign to address China and its misgivings.
Thank you, Algene. Jenny, please.
Sure, I would take it one further. The Chinese Communist Party is a grave threat, not only to our security and that of our allies and partners, but also to the values that we represent as a democracy and as a free and open society. And it is absolutely essential that we not minimize that problem, that we not minimize the evil that the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for, including a genocide of a Muslim minority population. I think it's good that this administration is working now tirelessly to raise attention to those evils and to the very grave threat that for too long went either overlooked or under-resourced in terms of the American response. The US must acknowledge the scale of this challenge. And my concern is that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration that could come into power have demonstrated some skepticism towards actually committing to doing the kinds of things that are necessary to push back on committed adversaries such as China. It's very good, for example, to profess that we must reestablish our alliances and reassure our alliance partners and to promote democracy around the world. But rhetoric alone does not solve these problems. Unfortunately, Joe Biden has a history actually of being skeptical sometimes of the use of military power where it is necessary. I hope that he is taking a very careful look along with his administration and his advisors at the scale of the challenges that the United States now faces, because it is going to get worse. The Chinese are expanding their aggression around the world, and that's not in response to President Trump. It's part of a clear and coherent vision that the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping have for asserting Chinese dominance at a global scale.
Thank you, Jenny. Danielle?
I'm not sure what you want me to add to that, Dana. Honestly, I think our two speakers have done a great job of laying out the challenge. I will give credit to Donald Trump for, I think, shifting global opinion on China. Was he helped by the Chinese Communist Party in doing that? Absolutely. Was he helped by COVID and their unwillingness to share data that would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives? Yep, he sure was. But I do think that there's been a sea change in attitudes towards the People's Republic of China and towards the Chinese Communist Party. And whether style or substance, I think that there will be not that much difference in approach by a Biden administration, because I think that this ship has sailed. And I think that was the choice that was made by Xi Jinping, not a choice that was made by Donald Trump or Joe Biden. The fact that Xi Jinping has been willing to stand by his oppression of the people of Hong Kong, that he has been willing to stand by his threats to the free and democratic people of Taiwan, that he has been unwilling to back down on the oppression of more than 1 million Chinese Muslim Uyghurs, notwithstanding the sanctions that have been imposed by the Trump administration for that genocide, for that attempted genocide. I don't want to call it a genocide yet. That is, I think, a choice that the Chinese government has made, and the US government has no choice but to go along. And for that reason, I see very little likelihood that a new administration, a Democratic administration, would change course. I hope they don't. There have been people on both sides of the aisle who have been late to this party. That's a shame for them. What we're looking at in the South China Sea, the Chinese, even today, were engaging aggressively against our own freedom of navigation missions. That's something that any commander-in-chief is going to have to deal with. And you know what? I don't envy any of them. This is a huge challenge. We who spend a lot of time talking about the Middle East, Jenny and I assume Algene as well. These are different issues. These are global challenges. and they are ones that are not going to lend themselves to any sort of summit in Madrid in which we try to force both sides to get along.
And I just want to add to that, because China's Belt and Road Initiative, we've talked about human rights, we've talked about the South China Sea. The Belt and Road Initiative is really something that we need to take on and figure out how we use our foreign assistance and our soft tools, soft power tools to address, because that right there is something that if you talk to any foreign country, whether it be in Africa, parts of Asia, they will push back around their engagement with China economically, because they say the US isn't there. We want to partner with the US, but China gives us funding for our projects with no strings attached. And so we really need to think about how, I'm not saying we shouldn't have strings attached in our foreign assistance, but we really need to think more strategically about our economic engagement strategies with some of these countries that China has really made headroads in.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask my last question that we moderated, but we do have some great questions coming in from our audience, and I want to make sure that we have time to get through some of these. Some of them are pretty meaty. So I want to raise that this is a panel of really esteemed women, and this is a field in national security and foreign policy, which is beginning to diversify, and each of you is really a pioneer in this field. While there is a growing number of women and folks of color in foreign policy and NatSec, national security, what do you think can be done to continue to diversify this field to ensure that we are really representative of the generation of which we represent? Jenny.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think mentorship is important. I've been very fortunate to receive high quality mentorship from a number of established people in this field, including both men and women, and it has made a huge impact on my career. And I can't emphasize enough how much that can help somebody break into this space. But I would also add a second simple recommendation, which is I actually think a primary requirement here is simply for people to slow down, for conference organizers that are pushing to meet deadlines and convene events and under an understandable amount of strain, for them not to reach for the easy names that come to mind or the most high profile individuals that they can slot in to make a flashy event. It's completely understandable how in some cases that happens. And there are a lot of really great people in this town that are being more thoughtful and more deliberate about how to convene a diverse set of voices. I want to commend them and to thank them for everything that they're doing. I think we can do even more. And I think it actually just requires slowing down and looking out there for the incredible voices that simply haven't been able to achieve quite enough profile to come to mind as easily, but are certainly available and would bring huge benefit to this conversation.
Thank you, Jenny. Algene.
So when I think about what we can do as a country on diversity, I think we need to, first of all, diversify our workforce, our foreign policy, national security workforce. And that means supporting and funding and increasing programs like the Pickering and Rangel Fellowship Program, the Payne Fellowship Program. I think we need to train young people, bring them in early in their careers and ensure that they continue along the pipeline. Because yes, Jennifer can be mentored at this stage in her career or throughout her career, but there are people of color that really don't have access. They can't study abroad overseas when they're in high school because they don't, or in college, they don't have the funding to do so. There are a lot of things that are barriers to people of color in particular getting into this space. When I was the policy director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I was the first woman of color in a leadership role, a senior leadership role on that committee that was in a management senior leadership role. And that's a shame in 2015, right? That is the case. That nobody in that pipeline was in that pipeline before me. When I remember moving from the House, having been in the House for 10 years, coming over to the Senate in 2012, and immediately was asked to be on leader at the time, Reed's diversity panel about, getting into the foreign policy space as a person of color. And I was the only one. And I'm like, I just got here. I was literally in the Senate for 2 weeks. And I'm like, how is this possible at this point that there is not anyone else, even a PRM, basically a legislative assistant or a policy advisor, in the Senate at this point on foreign policy and national security that is of color. I sat on that panel. I was the only person of color on that panel. And it was a shame. And still to this day, there is a serious lack of diversity, racial diversity. Right now, we commissioned, when Senator Cardin was the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, 2 GAO studies about diversity at State Department and USAID. And the numbers that came back were startling, right? 18% of our foreign affairs officers, foreign service officers, excuse me, are people of color. This is of any color, right? This is really stark. It's 34% of the population. And we are going all over the world, engaging with people from all different backgrounds. It would do us well, it would serve our interests to ensure that there are more people who are of color and can relate to those people. And it's established that trust. And not saying that they can't relate to other people. I'm saying it would be in our interest to do so. So there's a lot of things we can do. We need to invest at the presidential level, in a program, in someone at the administration, at the White House, that is responsible for diversity in the US government, right? That is responsible for not only bringing in diverse voices at the younger stage, but ensuring that people are able to get past that middle level through training, through mentorship, through programs that bring in the best and the brightest from diverse backgrounds into our USG. And it has to be something that is led by the White House and implement across the USG, including, of course, our national security and foreign policy agencies and departments.
Great, thank you so much, Algene. Danielle, I realize that you have to hop off in a few moments, but do you have any concluding thoughts on this question?
I couldn't begin to add to what these two lovely ladies have said. No, I defer to them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you for your participation and wisdom on this panel. I'd like to turn it over to our audience members, who we have some really interesting questions that are coming in. So this question is really open to everyone on the panel. But this question is concerning what we are seeing as rising autocratic governments, or rising autocratic leaders, I should say. What are best measures that the United States can take to prevent repeated interference by perhaps something like Russia or China, for that matter? And what could the State Department president et al. Do to convince detractors to this administration or the next, especially when engaging with relationships with those who might be seen as having autocratic ties? The question is really open to anyone. Maybe Danielle, as you have to hop off in just a moment.
I'd be happy to try and address that. Look, this is a huge challenge. Just as Algene was talking about the difficulty of implementing sort of democracy initiatives, this is not easy, and it requires a certain consistency across administrations. Promoting democratic governance and rule of law, and all of the rights that we like to talk about, civil rights, religious freedom, political freedom, the freedom of minorities to live without fear. All of those things are not things that you can do for a year and then give up on. And this is really the challenge that we faced, because there are lots and lots of other games afoot. When you want something from, when you want let's just go back to Egypt. When you want the president of Egypt to fight Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the Sinai, and you want him to do a good job because that represents a threat to all of the region, not to speak of the rest of us, how do you then talk to him about the fact that he has thousands of political prisoners in jail, extrajudicial killings? And for me, the answer is very straightforward, which is that if the United States government is incapable of chewing gum and walking, we really shouldn't be in the business of trying to lead the world. And unfortunately, what I hear from a lot of young people, what I hear from my students is, yeah, that's why we shouldn't be in the business of leading the world. And the answer to that, of course, is, yeah, but someone will. And I'm not quite sure who they're interested in nominating for that job. Is it the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans? The Europeans have in many ways abdicated responsibility on these issues, despite the fact that they like the United States to play a more pleasant role than it has during the Trump administration. At the end of the day, they are really never going to be the leaders on these matters. And that is why the United States needs to step up. We need to separate questions of geostrategic policy from questions of rule of law and governance. And that is something that I've argued for a lot with Democratic colleagues who work on the issues that I've worked on for many, 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 many years. And I continue to believe that this is something that we can do better. One of the things that has disappointed me intensely is the fact that the Congress has played a leadership role on this matter over the last decades. Democrats, Republicans, doesn't matter. And Congress has really stepped back on that. And I'm talking about the Democratic House and the Republican Senate, because Congress has been in many ways the torchbearer on issues of supporting democracy. And we need to ensure that this isn't just about governments we don't like. This isn't just about, Orban, who we don't like, or Putin, who we don't like. No, we don't like authoritarians wherever we find them. And that goes for Egypt, that goes for Hungary, but that can also go for Italy and other countries. So, there's a lot that we can stand up for, that we can fight for, and that I think our government can do effectively if only we remain committed to that. And with that, I'm going to thank you for all your forbearance and thank my very, very fine colleagues for being on this call. I'm sorry I have to hop. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, Jennifer or Algene, if you would like to take an approach at this question.
Sure, I would add, I once again agree with Danielle, unsurprisingly. What I would add is only that this is also not about forcing our views onto other countries or other populations. There are incredible people around the world that are risking everything in pursuit of the kinds of freedoms that we enjoy here, up against incredible forms of coercion and violence. And that is true now in Belarus, where we have the President Lukashenko gearing up to suppress a popular revolution. That is true in Hong Kong, where the Chinese are attempting to snuff out exactly the same. And it has been true across the Middle East, where so many brave men and women, and too often children, are taking an incredible brave stance in pursuit of these values, which the United States claims to defend, but too often falls short of doing so. And I often wish that our own leaders here in the United States had half as much courage as these men and women.
Thank you, Jenny. Algene.
Absolutely agree with both of my fellow panelists today. This is something that we need to address. We cannot separate engagement from criticism. When your friend does something you don't like, if you're a good friend, you tell them, I don't like what you did, and I think you were wrong, and here's how you can address this. And so even with our friends, with Italy, with other countries, we need to ensure that human rights, democracy is at the core and not a side thing that we talk about on the sidelines, right? It has to be a core of our foreign policy, of our foreign engagement. It has to be an important tenet that's right up there with security, that's right up there with development, et cetera. It has to be a core tenet, because if it's not, then we are ceding our leadership in the globe to the Chinas of the world, to the Russias of the world. And so I fully agree with these esteemed panelists that I'm here today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Our next question comes from someone based in Washington, D.C. And that question is, in your esteemed opinions, what do you see as the largest threat that we currently face here in the United States? We are currently undergoing, as we all are very well aware, an unbelievable global pandemic. We see rising autocracies. We see tremendous challenges. What do you see as the greatest threat to where we are currently positioned in 2020?
Jennifer, you want to take?
Sure, I'll start. I will offer the view that I think our greatest threat right now is internal. And I think it is a crisis of confidence in who we are as a nation, who we need to be as a nation in order to provide the fundamental liberties and protections alike that our population deserves and rightly demands, but also a crisis of understanding the role that America can and indeed must play in the world in order to continue to enjoy not just the freedoms and the standard of living that we enjoy here, but to enjoy our identity, our ability to continue to claim rightly to be leaders of the free world, to stand by the values that we established in our Constitution and have continued to fight for as we address problems here at home. I think we've lost our way. And I think this current election represents that. I think the last election represents that. And candidly, I don't see that going away anytime soon. I think, therefore, conversations like this one and discussions like this are absolutely essential. And I would like to see more debate and dialogue, not less, between people with different understandings of who this country is and needs to be, because we've lost the ability to have that conversation. And I think that in many respects is the greatest threat that we face.
Thank you, Jenny. Algene.
I absolutely agree with you, Jenny, that, what is going on in the American political system right now, the fact that there is, and I was in the Congress almost 20 years, and I saw a serious degrading of just even the most basic rules of decorum, the most basic respect and friendships that used to occur across the aisle. And the committee that I used to work on, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, used to be a functioning committee where we were able to get things done. And quite frankly, as I was leaving, and these days, the partisanship has really degraded their ability to actually work at all and get anything done. So that is a huge threat. I think another huge threat is just, again, similar to what Jennifer said, the lack of US global leadership on these important issues of especially governance, rule of law, adhering to our values, international values and norms, not US values and norms. These are internationally established values and norms around human rights, around governance, around democracy. And so I think the erosion of that is one of the greatest threats. I also think, and I will be the Democrat here and say climate change is a great threat, right? That we need to talk about, that I think that governance, if people recognize, needs to be addressed. And that's a great threat. The greatest threat, though, I think of it all is the lack and erosion of the democratic order in the world, and multilateralism, and talking to people who don't agree with you, and instilling and promoting rule of law and holding people accountable for that. And I think that is the biggest threat, but there are other important things that we need to look at. And China, as we already talked about, is another huge threat.
Thank you, Algene, and thank you, Jennifer, for that analysis. As you know, AJC has existed for 114 years, and our entire ethos is really wrapped in the idea of having civil thoughtful discourse on both sides of the aisle. So we're really so grateful that you are both so eschewed in this idea as well. So we might have time for one or two questions. So our next question comes from one of our leaders in Chicago, who asks, we have a lot of young professionals on the call, as this is hosted by Access, the Young Professional Division of AJC. Not all of our Access leaders are currently in positions where they can affect change on this quite a scale in terms of being a part of governments or think tanks or initiatives like this, but they are interested and invested in changing the world as leaders, as volunteers. What do you recommend that these young leaders do, and what actions can they take in order to ensure a more secure and a more just world?
So I think leadership starts at home. It starts in your communities. It starts with volunteering your time here. It starts with leading at your school, at your synagogue, in your community to address these issues. I think that that we don't all have to be out there rah-rah every day, but do what you can in a small way, find a way to contribute. I think there are lots of organizations like AJC that promote young people getting engaged and involved in leading. I think being a voice that can pick up a phone and say when there's something going on in Congress that you don't like, listen, I don't like this, I'm writing in or I'm calling in to tell you. I think there are little things that you can do that you can be a leader on. But honestly, for the first thing you need to look at is how you lead in your communities, and look around you at those that are less fortunate than you and the struggles that they face, and lead there, and also lead in the global community as well. But I think it all has to start at home.
Thank you so much, Algene. Jennifer.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I would simply add that, unfortunately, where we are as a nation, one does not need to go far, and often not far from home, in order to find examples of intolerance, injustice, and all kinds of other malign characters of our current national, debate and cohesion as a nation to fight against. And so I think it starts exactly where you're planted. I don't think you need a high profile or a high follower count or anything like that to do good. And I do truly believe that if you start at home, you start within your community, you start with whatever opportunities are presented in front of you, because they will be there, then the rest will follow.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that for those young professionals who are on the call, who were on our call last week and on our call this week, this is certainly lighting a fire in their bellies to continue to do this exciting and meaningful work. Algene and Jennifer, on behalf of all of AJC and Access, we want to thank you for joining us on this call today. It has been a truly exciting and interesting conversation, and we're so grateful for your time. And to everyone who's joined us today, we want to thank you for joining this session. We hope you will join us for future Remote Access and Advocacy Anywhere programs. Next week, you can join Access on September 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern for our Remote Access program, Shared Pride, a conversation about Jewish advocacy and the LGBTQ community, featuring Aria Marvazi, Managing Director for JQ International, and Rachel Freed, Executive Director for JQY. You can register for this exciting event at ajc.org/advocacy anywhere. If you like what you've heard today, please consider making a gift to AJC, information which can be found on our homepage. Thank you and be well. Thank you again, Algene and Jennifer, and we hope to continue this conversation in the future.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Be well, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.